From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
If you work on an Android app, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to presume you do, you will know that when your user reports a problem or a crash, it's the absolute worst feeling. To make matters worse, they might one-star your app, go on Twitter and complain about the app, and if they're feeling particularly merciless, probably go on Reddit or something and post it there. But you know what? They have absolutely every reason to. If you treat your customers basically as an offsite QA team, it's rude to them and it's just bad for business. As developers, we don't want to rely on customers to report errors. Instead, we want to catch this much early on. Ideally, you just have automated tests and these tell you when there's a problem. But as we've talked about on the show multiple times, that's not always as easy as we want it to be. Because writing tests can be hard. That's why Sentry, our sponsor for today's show, tells you about errors in your code before your customers have a chance to encounter them. Not only do they tell you about the errors, they also give you helpful details that help you fix these errors. For example, how many users were impacted by this bug, the complete stack trace if it's a crash, the commit ID when this error was released, the engineer who wrote this line of code that was busted, that and a whole lot more. If your code is broken, let's fix it together. That's Sentry's tagline. I love it. You can check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Sentry is a pretty common word. It's actually a pretty cool name for the service if you know the English meaning of the word. But I want to make sure you get that domain name right. It's sentry.io. Once again, sentry.io/for, as in FOR/Android. Check them out today and fix your errors before your users encounter them. Thanks for sponsoring today's show, Sentry.
Kaushik, remember when we went to Android Dev Summit?
That is right. Android Dev Summit was a lot of fun. It was the second time that Google hosted this conference for Android developers after a certain period. There was I think a year or two, probably a year that they had a gap for this one.
Was it? Yeah, I don't remember. I didn't go to the first one. This was the first one that I went to, but it was fun. There was all kinds of folks there. It was, what I really liked about it was actually how small the venue was. You were literally forced to interact with people. So even if you were an introvert, finding a quiet place was actually kind of a hard thing to do, which could kind of stress people out. But overall, I felt like it was a good thing because we were able to communicate with so many different people. And one of those people that we spoke to is actually someone that we wanted to have on the show today.
Yeah, that's right. The venue was the Computer History Museum here in California, here in Mountain View. But the person that we met was Jeroen. So we thought, I think literally we ran into him as we were grabbing coffee or something, and he had some really cool things to talk about, in terms of home automation and a topic that both of us are very, very interested in. So without further ado, let's bring Jeroen onto the show. Welcome to the show, Jeroen.
Hey, Kaushik. Hey, Don. Glad to be on the show.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. When we ran into you at in line getting coffee at the Dev Summit, one of the things that we noticed in talking to you was where you had worked. So if you could kind of give folks a brief rundown of where you work, maybe kind of how you got into Android development, what you do now, then we can kind of kick it off from there.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't really study computer science. I studied microelectronics, but I never really worked for a day in microelectronics. It's a bit too abstract. And I joined Philips 8 years ago. And then the first day they literally asked me hey, what do you want to do? Hardware or software? And I was I don't know. And then they needed to have some mobile apps prototyped. So I already could do a bit of Java, and I just rolled into Android, built a couple of cool prototypes like encoding audio or data in an audio signal and swapping Wi-Fi networks and stuff like that. Oh. And then after a while, I actually decided hey, this Android thingy is cool. So I wrote a couple of apps of myself. Then I did consultancy for a couple of years. And then 3 years ago, I joined Philips Hue. And I'm now currently the lead Android developer there.
Very cool. Very cool. At my place here, I use a bunch of like I've tried to replace all my bulbs with the Philips Hue bulbs because it's, I mean, for folks who haven't used it, it's super cool. Like you can obviously control it with Google Home, with all the other like home automation services, and with some of them you can also control like the hue, as in like the actual color. You can control those uh, colors as well for the lamp. It's pretty cool. But when we were talking about you also mentioned that you had a recent project that you were going through at your own home, Jeroen, and that sounded pretty cool. Can you like give us a little rundown on that?
Yeah, indeed. So actually, a few years ago, we wanted to buy a house, but we couldn't really find what we were looking for. And then we found this lot of land. We bought it and decided to build a house on it. So past year, I actually built my own house. And then as I was working for Philips Hue, I now have like Hue integrated everywhere. So now my house is actually completely, at least lighting wise, it's completely smart. So it just works for me, which is pretty
Oh,
neat.
nice. Oh, what does that mean? What does like just works mean? Like, so does like if you walk to a room automatically, does it just like do the lights come on, or like yeah? Well, what are the different integrations that you have?
Yeah, so actually, you need to like light can have different functions, right? So you have a lot of like functional light, or you can like have ambience light or whatever. And what I typically do is like in all of the spaces that are transitional, where you just pass by for like a minute or two, I have motion sensors there. So when I would enter like my dressing room, I can just enter it, lights go on, I can pick what I want to wear, and I just leave and the lights go off again.
Hmm.
I have the same thing in my bathroom and my storage and the toilet. So like all of the transitional areas, they just like the light goes on when it should and it goes off automatically after.
Oh,
And
nice.
then in all of the other spaces, I actually have, yeah, I either have dedicated wall switches or I can use my Google Home. And then I can actually like cycle through different scenes. So then I can just like, if I press in my kitchen once, then it's just like, it goes on to this breakfast-like scene. And if I press it the second time, then it goes full bright. So I can actually do cooking in the evening. And then I have a couple of like really ambience mode thingies to like, yeah, just be nice if you're chilling out in the evening and stuff like that. And I have like for every different room, I have it programmed in a different way so that exactly serves my needs actually.
Don has a party mode scene. So basically, every time his tests run, he's like, Philips Hue, hit the party mode scene. And then, he has like a little thing going. It's
You
true
got like
story.
disco
That's
balls and
cool.
everything.
No, what's actually pretty neat is like with these motion sensors, they're really smart. So if I enter my bathroom in the middle of the day, then the light won't even go on because there's sufficient light already. But if I enter it like yeah in early evening, the lights go on
Mm.
just to full brightness. But like if I come in it like right before I go to bed, then they only go like on very subtly to like a very yellowish light to really help me go to sleep, and they really support me in like becoming tired and not staying up that late.
That's
Oh,
awesome,
so it's like a
actually.
real time flux mode. It's like the live flux
Yeah,
sort of
Flux
indeed.
thing.
in real life.
Yeah, flux in real life.
Yeah, and once you get used to that, it's really really hard coming back. It's really I think there's really like yeah the health benefits they claim there. I think that's really that's a real thing. It's not a gimmick.
One thing that annoys me the most about motion sensors, so the building that I live in, like the garage has a motion sensor, but it's like one of the super dumb ones. So as soon as someone enters in, like it'll like light up the lights. But if it doesn't recognize any movement after a certain point of time, what happens is it just like turns off. And like and I think the setting they have is like a little aggressive. So what happens is as you're like getting ready, or like your car like engine's warming up, like the lights will all just go off, and it's like kind of creepy. So is that something that you've run into, or is like are the new age home automation systems just much better at that kind of stuff?
So what I tend to end up with is like you don't want to set your timeouts too aggressively. So I set them a little bit longer.
I
And
see.
when I'm then really like, yeah, for instance, when I'm fixing the plumbing underneath my sink, yeah, then the motion sensor isn't going to pick me up, right?
Hmm.
Or like now I'm recording in my dressing room. So the motion sensor, yeah, the light is going to go out if I don't do anything. So then you can just, in the app, you can disable it temporarily and then just turn it back on when you need it again. So there is this manual override. It's fairly simple, but yeah, you will notice that like the more you move into these like full home automation thingies that it's magnificent when it works, and you can strive to get it working like 95, 99% of the time, but in the end you get so spoiled that when it doesn't work, it can be a bit annoying.
It's like, damn it all.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
Now, quick question for you in regards to this home automation stuff. I'm in the bucket of folks who has basically zero home automation other than a Google Home, and then I happen to have a couple of Nests, and I don't really have anything automated in regards to those. I just kind of control them with my phone. If I wanted to get started with, lights or anything or anything of that nature that you already have in your setup now, what would you recommend to me or to someone in my situation to say, all right, here's kind of what you're going to get the most bang for your buck, and you can actually see and experience, what this is going to be like to see if it's for you?
Yeah, so I think what people typically think about, if they think about Philips Hue, then it's like these lights that can do all of these different colors, because I think our lights can do 16 million colors, and that's amazing. It's really, don't get me wrong, that's really amazing, but typically you just configure it to one color and then you just stick with that, or you cycle through a few ones. But if you go for these lamps that do these different shades of white, that they can go from a very cool bluish white to help you wake up in the morning and to help you focus, to a very yellowish white to really help you go to sleep, that's really where I would start. And those lamps also tend to be a bit cheaper. And then, it's the most interesting to me is still to have a motion sensor, because once you're used to entering one room and the light just goes on and you don't need to hit the buttons anymore, and then when you enter the room in the middle of the night, that the light doesn't go on full brightness but only like on a low brightness, so you can just pick up something from the fridge and then head back. Once you're used to that, then I think you're gonna easily scale up and look for other solutions for your problems. So I would start with really lamps that can do shades of white, and also a motion sensor, I guess.
Okay. And where would you say that you would realize the biggest improvement of your life having a motion sensor? Say I was just to go buy one. Would you say, hey, put it inside of your bathroom, put it in your bedroom, put it in the kitchen, or what would, every house is different, of course, so it's kind of hard to say, but if you had to just generalize, what would you say?
So then I would say, I would either pick like bathroom or kitchen, to be honest, because there you really have these use cases where you tend to enter these rooms in a sleepy mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really when you're sleepy and you don't want to be woken up completely, that's where you really have like a dramatic benefit on top of your existing system, right? That's something that you cannot do in another way. So that's where I would start. That's also where I started, actually. I started in my kitchen, I guess. And then my storage, then my bathroom. And then I tried the bedroom for a while, but I stopped doing that. But it's also a bit of experimentation, obviously.
And I mean, in the end, we're nerds/tinkerers at heart, right? So how exactly does it work? Did you actually have to write a mini program of sorts, or scripts or something that you feed into these Hue bridges or the Philips Hue lamps, or how does that work? In the end, or is it mostly just through the UI of the app? How do you control some of these pieces where you have logic associated to it, right? When you enter here, or you find motion for X amount of time, where is all that controlled?
Yeah, so I think this is actually the key benefit of the Hue system. So we have an open API, so anyone can build an app against our system, or a website, or whatever, like a Mac OS app. It doesn't really matter. So it's an open system. There's more than 600 apps available for you. And what you can just do, if you buy our system, we deliver you with a free app. That's the app that I work on. And it's gonna help you configure everything in the way that we think is best for you. So you get an out-of-the-box option that works really well. But if you're a more advanced user, then you can just explore different apps to see what they offer, because others can also innovate on top of our system. And if you're a really advanced user like me, then you can also just program everything you want yourself. So for instance, what I have in my living room is really completely custom built, because now recently, since half a year, we also have we integrate with vendors that actually make wall switches. So I have Hue wall switches that look exactly the same as my other wall switches. And those ones I completely programmed custom. And now they do exactly what I want them to do.
Very cool. Very cool.
So it seems like there's so much stuff that you can do, because as soon as you open up an API to do these things, there's a ton of stuff that you can do. What's, and this could be something you've seen or you've seen at your company, or something you've even done at your company. What's some of the cool things you've done with the technology to enable something that you hadn't previously thought of, or something you've seen out there?
Well, that's actually a good question. I think the nice stuff is like the if this then that. So then you can just if you want to know what the weather is, you can just have your lamp in the morning turn bluish or yellowish depending on what the weather is going to be. So that's like the basic stuff. But I've also seen apps that make really for special events, special solutions. Like if you do I don't know what the English term for it is, but it's not really the baby shower, but it's like where you announce the gender of your baby.
Oh yeah.
Then you have apps that can actually help you to that they would flash the lights bluish and then pink, bluish, pink, bluish, pink. And then it goes faster and slower, and in the end it settles down on the sex of the baby. Which is cool, right? So that's like a real wow effect if you have people over. Or apps to have that you can put your lights in a pumpkin during Halloween, and that they would then
cool.
flash and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's an incredibly powerful and creative system. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's so many apps I haven't tried yet.
Very cool, very cool. One last question before we start talking about some other stuff, and we move on to our next topic. You mentioned the APIs that you can write against, right? Is there a specific website or something that you can point us to that we can take a look at, so our listeners can have a look at that stuff?
Yeah, so I'll also make sure that it ends up in the show notes, but I think it's developer.meetyou.com.
Okay.
And there we actually have getting started guides on how to do basically anything, and then you can just kickstart your development from there. You can start very simple, but yeah, you can do really, really advanced stuff once you get the hang of it.
Very cool, very cool. Now, Jeroen, we have seen the talk that you gave recently, and this is about our next topic, which is rewriting the app. Rewriting the app is definitely something that Don and I have talked about in the past, offline. It's also a topic that's been getting a lot of interest right now in the community, with some big companies talking about how they've approached rewriting their app. So can you give us can you talk to us a little about what spurred this topic in your mind? Why did you feel you need why did this topic suddenly take such an important part where you're hey, I need to give a talk on this?
Yeah, it's a discussion that I think it sounds familiar to most developers, right? It's also something that I encountered quite a few times in my career already, where you have this idea of hey, you know what? We're now in a state where we're unhappy with the architecture. We wish we could do RxJava or Kotlin or whatever, but yeah, our code base is already 3 years old, and then it's not really easy to integrate these new technologies in it, and we have bugs, and yeah, it's just it's not a fun project to work on anymore because of all of these real issues that we're having. And then people tend to think yeah, what if we could just throw it all away and rewrite from scratch? What if we could do that? And that looks like it looks like a very promising solution, because yeah, if you start from scratch, then you don't have any legacy anymore, and then you can just do things right, and you can really set everything up in exactly the same way that you want it, and so on. But actually, one of the key pitfalls there is every app was a greenfield once, right? And if you now talk to fellow Android developers that I encounter at conferences and so on, and you ask them hey, how is everything going on your project? And for some way or the other, we all seem to be in the same boat, where refactoring is a very important part of our day-to-day life, and that we made choices that are a bit inconvenient and that we wish we could do differently. And I just wanted to basically make clear that a rewrite is a bit of a broken promise. It's not a silver bullet. There's actually quite a few challenges you're going to run into. And I just wanted to make a clear statement. Hey, it's not this is something you should never ever do. But if you do it, be aware of all of these things, and also be aware that you may not really end up where you had hoped to end up, right? So, and then it felt like this real software engineering topic that wasn't really talked about enough in the Android community, from my opinion.
When you were kind of tossing this, idea around in your head, at what point did you consider that a lot of folks maybe think like, well, maybe we can refactor into a better code base? Or what do you think are the thoughts on that? Do you think a lot of people consider maybe just refactoring into a better code base? Or do you think they just happen to say like, hey, we're just going to just throw this to the side and build something new?
So I think we're all professionals, right? So we do also know that if you rewrite something from scratch, I think all of us know that that's going to take quite some time, right? It's not like we work on small apps anymore. The era of small apps it has passed a few years back. But yeah, I think we all try to refactor. And in the end, yeah, refactoring, even if it's successful, it can still be non-satisfactory, right? Because if you clean up a bit here and a bit there and a bit there and a bit there, then you may end up like at the end of the day with this feeling like, what did I now accomplish? And how is this now fundamentally better? And then I think it's this combination of, that the outlook seems to be that it's going to take you a lot of time to actually have everything refactored and have everything in the way you want it to be, plus the combination that like the current way of progress and the current way of refactoring doesn't really provide like very satisfactory short-term rewards and results. I think it's the combination of those two who basically trigger people to think about like more radical, more aggressive solutions to the problem.
In my mind, one thing you said sort of like resonated pretty well, right? You're like, when people started off, they obviously did not start with the impression of writing code that it would eventually lead to, like a bunch of spaghetti ball mess. The impression is always like, oh, I want to write clean code. And you said, well, when you rewrite the app, you go with the intention of like making sure it's written clean, but there's always a chance that you eventually will end up in the same place that you were before, right? So I guess the challenge then is like, in my mind, usually when I want to refactor something, I usually try to convince myself saying like, I am refactoring this piece of code because of 3 reasons, right? And if I can give those 3 reasons, if I can pass those 3 reasons around and people are like, yeah, that makes sense, like, that's fair, then it's worth like even like attempting it. If not, it's, like it's probably me just trying to satisfy like a developer itch or something, which sometimes like, when you have a running business, it's not probably the wisest of decisions. In your mind, have you found like any specific things that you thought were drivers towards like, oh, that's a good reason to like rewrite the app or like, refactor? Like what are some of the good reasons as to why one might consider rewriting the app or like refactoring portions of it?
Yeah, so refactoring, I think there's always a reason to refactor, right? Because in the end, the true cost of software is in its maintenance. So in that sense, if you can decrease maintenance, then refactoring is probably a good idea because you're going to just earn it back over time. For rewriting, that's obviously, it has a lot of pitfalls. So there's a lot of stuff you have to look out for. I think we can cover them a bit later. But because it's such a radically different approach and because it's such a risky thing, then you really need to have a good reason. And for instance, what we did in our current Android app, we rewrote our complete testing framework. And that's just simply because the technology we were using, Calabash, wasn't supported anymore. So we kind of had to, right? So that's just like, that's a no-brainer. There is no other way to do it. But there's like, there's other reasons maybe, like if you want to move to a completely different architecture and UI paradigm at the same time, then maybe it makes sense. Maybe your app is just like super, super small and you can rewrite it in 2 weeks, then it may also make sense. So there's like a few scenarios where you can actually, where it does make sense. But I think overall, it's just, if anything, rewriting your app is just super risky, right? And the end result is like, there's no guarantee that you're going to end up in a better place.
And I mean, that's a good distinction to draw out. Like, and it must be obvious by now, but folks should realize like the only thing that's common between refactoring and rewriting is the prefix RE. They're like very different. Other than that, like, rewriting is the one that I think Jeroen is like pointing towards being, that's the one you should approach with way more caution. than refactoring.
Yeah.
So do you have maybe some guidelines or some heuristics that you follow to determine like, all right, this is a good time to rewrite? Use the Calabash example. Maybe there's an unsupported library. That's a great example. Do you have any other types of examples of like, hey, this is a good time to rewrite the application, or does it meet any certain criteria for you to kind of give the thumbs up on that?
So to be honest, not really. So I think maybe, for instance, if you say like, we have like the promise of like throwing away 2 apps and replacing them by 1, like Flutter seems to be making, maybe that's the net benefit that you would have like over the long run, because you have like a better development experience of like quickly deploying your app with the instant deploy, and then you have only 1 code base you have to maintain instead of 2. Maybe that could be like a killer reason, but then still you need to accept taking the risk, right?
Yeah.
And I think my point of view is like, why would you take the risk? Because you could also split your app, the big spaghetti hairball, you could split it like in a lot of vertical slices of stuff that isn't coupled to each other anymore. And then you can simply rewrite parts of your app, so you don't need to take the risk of doing the big bang. And those parts that you rewrite, you can just ship them with the feature toggle, so you can gradually roll them out or roll them back if something goes wrong. So there's like, I don't really believe in a rewrite, because then you don't do much risk mitigation, right? And as a professional, I tend to be wary of risk. And that's also why I say like, why not just do something more gradually, that the end result is to have like a better code base.
Okay.
But the problem is, if you rewrite it, you're also going to like spend a lot of time and effort in like parts of your code that aren't problematic to begin with, right? You're going to rewrite all of the settings screen, the about screen, the open source licenses. You need to set up a new CI. You need to do all of these things. And those are just like, even if the code is bad, it's probably code that you hardly ever touch. So it's not like it's a big problem in your development flow, but spending time on rewriting those just like doesn't provide much user value, right? And the user is in the end all that matters.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, it seems like it's super risky. So what do you usually, what do you say to folks who are telling you, hey, we're thinking about rewriting our application? Do you give them some particular pieces of advice or things to try to do before rewriting, or how have you approached this?
Yeah, so I had quite a few people like after my talk coming to talk to me, and then they basically said like, we're now rewriting our app and it seems to be going fairly successful. And then I asked them like, okay, fine. So when did you start and when did you think you were going to be finished? And then, in the end, it turned out to be like they expected it to take 4 months, and they were now 4 months in and they needed another 2 months. So then probably if they're 2 months further, then they need another 1 month.
Yeah.
Which could still be fine, right? Because success is also, what is success? Even if your app, like, maybe the rewrite even takes 3 years, but then the end result is such an overwhelming user success. Like the Titanic movie went, miles and bounds above budget. And still, when it came out, it was a huge success, right? So it also depends a bit how you define success, but I just think you need to think about all of the concerns that I raised in my talk, take a step back and really, avoid like just giving into the itch of like, I really want to rewrite, but instead base it on like really good arguments and then see like, you know what, we think it's going to work for us because of these and these reasons. And as long as you follow a process like that and you have buy-in of your management and your entire team, I think that's the key thing, right?
I mean, as you mentioned in your talk, right? Like this is exactly where like when you start to rewrite, like reality kicks in and you're like, oh, this is actually not as simple as I thought, you know?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So if you want, I can highlight like a few of the issues that you may not have thought about
sure.
when considering a rewrite.
Please, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it may be a bit typical of the company where I work, but one of the requirements that we usually get, like if you rewrite, then our product managers would say like, hey, you know what, we understand that your code is in a bad shape, so I want to give you the time to do things right so we can then go faster after. But we can't leave our users in the cold for like 4 months or 5 months and then just give them fewer features, right? So we need to at least give them the features that we that we now already have. And that's problematic because you probably thought of like building a skateboard first and then a bike and then a car and a Ferrari. But all of a sudden you have to build everything immediately again. And that's just going to be so much more work than you anticipated.
Right. And then there's the other trouble also that you were mentioning along those same lines, right? Where, what do you do for the existing users? You can't just give them the new version. So you also have to have like both of these versions running simultaneously at some point, right?
Yeah, indeed. The old users are going to keep on using your old app, right?
Yeah.
And the longer the rewrite takes, the more you're actually going to have to do to the old app. Because if your company decides to rebrand themselves, swap to a new font, a new color scheme, whatever, launch a new product you need to have support for, all of those things will also have to end up in a new app, right? And if you then have like a significant Android release, like Android O, where suddenly there were a lot of background restrictions, what you could do in the background, then it could even push you to go rather fundamentally to the drawing board for the old app just to make it work again. So those are now like, two problems, but you also have like designers that want to like, redesign your app, because obviously if you're writing from scratch, you might as well change the design, right? If you change the design, there's going to be like minor inconsistencies or usability issues. And then, you'll have to fix those. So instead of writing every screen once, you may have to write some screens more than once. And the same is going to happen with your requirements. And then, obviously also, if your app is complex enough to rewrite it in the first place, then probably also all of the requirements in the app are going to be quite complex, right? And then you're going to end up at this point that's like, where's the documentation? You can't find the documentation. You're going to have to start digging around at the old source code to find how everything is working, to find all of the edge cases and so on. So that's just going to prove to be a lot more complex than you thought it was going to be. And then when you pull everything together and you spend the time in rewriting everything, probably you went a bit, beyond your planning. So you thought this was going to be like X months, but in the end, it turned out to be like 50% more, or maybe even, twice as much of work. But if you then have this new app that you worked on for like, let's say with a small team of like 3 to 4 people for half a year, how are you going to launch it? Because if you launch it, it's a big button switch, right? It's just like, this big red button that you're going to push overnight and then just hope everything goes well. That's scary, right?
You bring up something that was very interesting there. Like you have this big app that you've written with the team, you're ready to push it out. And there's a few things that really can go sideways here. Is A, that the market may just completely just bash it and hate the app, which we've seen that happen many times. People write an app and customers just can't stand it. Or B, something's completely wrong in the application, and then all of a sudden you've released it. Well, how do you roll that back? And then just prior to us recording today, you were telling us about a couple of articles that recently came out about some of these things that some companies have done to mitigate some of this risk. Would you mind telling us a little bit about some stuff that you've read or how people can mitigate this risk in general?
Yeah, so it was a series of articles by Uber, which I liked very, very much. But before we get started, spoiler alert, it's at Uber scale, so it's probably quite a bit. They have a lot more resources than most of us have. But what I liked about what they did is they wrote a complete blog post detailing why they rewrote their app. And they actually based it like on past data of, we tried this before, for instance, rewriting parts and then migrating all of the data. And it didn't work for us. There were a lot of issues there. And they had their different apps. So they have a rider app and they have a driver app, and one app had a different architecture than the other one. And they said like, the other architecture has proven to work really well for us. So if you move to that architecture, then we suddenly have like our maintenance becomes easier and we can also better solve our problems. And they had real like technical issues. So they really had downtime because of technical debt. And that's obviously for Uber is like a loss of revenue. But what I liked about it is they detailed like their entire thinking process. They spent a full post on it and they explained why it was a good choice for them. And they also just very openly and honestly say like, we think for us this was the right choice, but it may not be the right choice for you. It really depends on your case. And then the key thing that you're also hinting at is, so one of the major things that they did, which was, very, very interesting to read. So they actually completely mitigated the risk of launching a new app by bundling both the old and the new app into one binary, so into one APK file, and then deploying the two apps at the same time.
Yeah, that's
And then
just
they built
crazy.
this.
It's fascinating.
Yeah,
That blog post was just like, crazy. We'll make sure to add links to both of those in the show notes.
yeah, indeed, because they then leveraged their existing like infrastructure of data analysts to basically very, very closely monitor the release of those apps. And then they could remotely feature toggle between one app or the other app. So they could only roll it out in one city and then see how it works there, or roll it back. And what's really cool about that, one trick they also did is, so imagine if you roll out, you basically roll out to the new app, but something goes wrong and your feature toggle framework breaks. So then users might end up being stuck and can never go back again to the old app. So what they also built in is this offline mode where if they see that the new app crashed, so the next time you start the app, you will always fall back to like the old app. So they built in like these very clever and also, very complex safety mechanisms just to make sure that they could actually roll out as smoothly as possible. So I think in their case, they had like very good arguments to do it. Plus, they also, in my opinion, they mitigated the most complex thing they had. And so the most complex thing, actually rolling it out to users, they did a lot of work mitigating the risks there. So I'm happy it worked out well for them.
Yeah, and also like again, you were good to point out that this is something that was achieved at Uber scale. It's important to remember that like sometimes, because you need the resources to be able to like make sure each of these pipelines of like rolling it out exist. Like you have people like working on that stuff. You also have folks who are maintaining the two features, right? Because what that inherently means is you need to have like both features on like both the old system and new system, right? And as you start like developing, like it just seems like something that would require like massive amounts of resources. So
a lot.
yeah, just something to like keep in mind for folks. Like this is a really cool way of doing things, but it's not necessarily the way that everyone should be doing it.
Yeah, indeed. And it's also, if you spend a lot of resources in rewriting your app, then you're also not spending those resources in building new features for the existing app, right? So in essence, you're also giving your competition a chance to catch up or even take over on you. So it's also a risk to actually lose market share to competition.
Right. So I guess at this point, we understand like the risks, or like like what could potentially go wrong with like us embarking on this endeavor of like just rewriting the whole app. So how should I do it then? Like if like these are like the problems, like is there like a better way that you would suggest? Like what are some of the learnings that you saw from having like rewritten the app, or like from talking to different people who have like done this?
Yeah, so we already touched upon it, and it's basically, instead of rewrite, it's a refactor. Because if you refactor your app, so don't get me wrong, refactoring is also challenging. It can also be dull and unrewarding at times, but it has some like key benefits. Because if you refactor, and if every step you take is a step in the right direction, then you're going into the right direction by design, right? You're sure you're going to end up at something that's at least better than what you currently have. And you can always continue to ship. So every sprint, you can basically choose like to refactor a bit more or to provide a bit more features. So you can always just like choose between features or refactoring. You don't lose all of those bug fixes, all of those years of bug fixing that you have. And you can just start doing it tomorrow, right? You don't need to have big lead times or whatever. Whereas if you rewrite, it's going to take you a few months to have results. But obviously, if you refactor, there's like a few key things you need to have, because if you want to make things better, you need to be able to define what is better. Where do we want to go? What technologies do we want to use? Do we want to use Kotlin? Do we want to do RX? Do we want to use architecture components? So you really need to set, as a team, a clear goal. So you also, with the entire team, you work towards that goal. Because this is something, apps have become too big. So it's not something you can do by yourself anymore, right? You really need to have the support and buy-in of the entire team. And so if you have like the buy-in of the entire team, you have a very clear goal, then you can actually start making it better. And one of the key things in making something better is you need to know that refactoring is typically hard, because if you change something in one place, most of the code is like a bit spaghetti code. And if you change something in one place, it may very well cascade to another place and then another place and another place. And then before you know it, instead of like cleaning up one single method, you've touched like 20 different files, right? And imagine that you want to do that and still be able to like make sure you don't introduce any bugs, that people can still review it and so on. So to make that possible, you really need to have like a very good and fast CI in place. A CI that can just like run your builds in a matter of minutes, that you know like, okay, yeah, all of the tests have passed, my espresso tests have passed, lint is passing. So you know like this change that I made, it adheres to the quality bar we've set. People have reviewed it, and then you can just quickly integrate it. And the reason why the CI is so important, because if it takes you a long time to build the changes you've made, then people are actually going to create fewer pull requests. And the fewer pull requests you create, the bigger they're going to be, the harder it's going to be for other people to review them, and the lower the overall quality is going to be when you integrate it in the app, right? Because you're going to have merge conflicts, you're going to have to solve those. But yeah, every merge conflict you solve is basically flipping a coin, and so on. So you really need to make sure that you have like buy-in of the team, a clear goal, and then a way where you can very, very quickly integrate the changes into master, so you can really iteratively drive it forward and release as fast as possible, so you can actually validate it with users that it's actually doing what it should be doing. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Out of curiosity, you said like use a CI. Did you specifically use one CI, or were there any things that you ran across in like that tooling chain?
Yeah. So we spend a lot of time and effort in making sure that our PR builds. So everything on our PR runs in under 5 minutes. That's including espresso tests, and the way we pulled that off. So because we're a big company, it's very difficult to basically move to a cloud CI, because then you expose your copyright, your secrets in code to some third-party service. So we had to build our own service, which we did based on Jenkins. So now all of our builds are Dockerized, and we can just spin up multiple builds in parallel.
Wow.
And we currently still run them on so we run our tests on devices that we manage ourselves, but we're now actually in the process of moving that to an online test farm, so we can even get rid of the design of the device maintenance. So we're really we're thinking hard and setting something up that is as scalable as possible. And you don't really want to have developers being involved in making sure that the CI works, right? Because developers like developing apps. They're not usually, some do, but most mobile developers, they're not super happy when they need to do a lot of CI work. And that also means that, we're probably also not the best at doing CI work. We're better at actually building apps.
So you mentioned something really important there, was espresso tests. At least for me, I know when I'm developing anything, refactoring, anything of that nature, the tests are like my safety net to make sure I didn't mess anything up, and also to make sure that future functionality continues to work after additional changes have been made. In regards to like a large refactor, what level of importance are you placing on tests for yourself and for your team?
Yeah, so I think if you don't write tests, you're going to write future regret, right? It's just, if you have an app and you want to continue building features on top of it, without having automated tests in place, you simply cannot scale it. And you're going to just end up with having to do more manual testing, and then more manual testing will basically mean finding bugs later than you would find them with an automated test. So we're very, very big on testing. So we write a lot of unit tests. So that's just to make sure that everything works on a method level and on a class level.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, we do feature tests. So our app is split in multiple features. So we have espresso tests that basically go through those entire features. And then we also have smoke tests where you just where you actually walk very long paths throughout the entire app to basically see that the key user flows, that they keep on working. And what we try to do is we try to now balance the tests that we run in what case. So for instance, on a PR build, we don't run all of our tests. We run a subset of those tests. That's because we want to have the developer productivity and still the safety. So we try to balance both. So before we release it, we will run our entire test suite. But yeah, we don't do that on every case. We try to be very smart about what we run when.
So for your 5-minute builds, what's included in those 5-minute builds? Like what kind of tests?
So we basically see for every feature, we try to see, did something change in this feature? Because every feature is a separate module. And if we detect a change, then we run the tests for that feature. Otherwise, we don't. We run all of the unit tests. So unit tests we always run. For Espresso tests, we test changes for features. And then we have a subset of like smoke test scenarios. So the key scenarios, like what's key for us is that you are still able to control your lights and trigger scenes, that you can always do that. So that's like a subset of those tests we run.
Interesting.
And then on top of that, we do lint checks, we run detect, and that's it, I guess. Yeah.
Now, in your talk, I think you had also, if I remember correctly, you had talked about modularizing your app, and you just mentioned that in the testing there. Would you mind, talking a little bit about that? And I think you had something said about making changes or modularizing was helping that. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think one of the key problems that we have is, so everything used to be one big app, right? One big spaghetti, and everything was connected to everything, which is very hard to then refactor it and make it better. But the thing is, so what we're now trying to do is, so it's hard to change something big, but it's easier to change something smaller, right? So we're now slicing our app in several different modules. And by slicing it, we actually make sure that those modules no longer depend on each other. So we have like our app, which depends on a layer of features, and all of those feature modules are completely decoupled. They don't depend on each other. And then we have a business layer with a few modules underneath it. And that's like, common functionality that everyone reuses.
Okay.
But the key thing is those features are completely decoupled. So we can do one feature in Kotlin, the other one in Java, the other one in Flutter, the other one in React Native, and we don't really care about it because the contract around it is just like, hey, I need to have this, give it to me. And then, for instance, I need to pick a color, and then you pick a color, and when the color is picked, you just get like the value of the picked color back.
Interesting.
And what's cool about that, it makes your build faster, it allows you to do instant apps, but it also allows you to basically become completely independent of the internal implementation. So if you split up part of your app as like this feature module, the way I described it, then you can, for that module, you can just choose like, hey, you know what, maybe we should rewrite this module. And if you rewrite that one, then it's going to be a hell of a lot less work than rewriting your complete app. You can do a staged rollout to see, because you can ship 2 features in the same app, the old one and the new one, and then do a staged rollout. But you can actually, so you have the ability to rewrite it, or you can just refactor it, or you can decide like, the code is bad, but we don't really care about it, right? We can just, it's the about screen. We know the code is bad. Now at least it's like separated from the rest of our app, so let's just park it. So by modularizing your app, you have all of these developer benefits, but on top of that, you can also like make these more aggressive, more dramatic steps forward, where you basically try to structurally improve your app by rewriting parts of it without having all of the disadvantages and risks that you would have with a full-blown rewrite.
That makes sense. I have so many questions about how the feature modules and everything are all set up, but that's literally its own episode, so I'm not going to dive into that can of worms right now. One of the things I know that usually helps quite a bit when you're using different feature modules and so forth is the tooling that's available to you as a developer. And I know just from our personal discussions that you said something about mastering your tools and just becoming the best person the best version of yourself, as the meme says, around your tools is what's going to help you be super productive. Would you mind talking a bit about that and the tooling and why mastering it might help benefit you quite a bit?
Yeah, it's actually, so if you read any book on refactoring, one of the very first things they're going to tell you is like, if you want to refactor, you need to have a good suite of automated tests in place. And this is a bit like the chicken or the egg problem, right? Because most legacy code bases aren't very well tested. So in that sense, how on earth can you start making that better? And then one of the key arguments that I make is like, yeah, you should really learn your tools and master your tools. Because I think by now everybody knows that you can just ask Android Studio to rename a class. And if you rename the class, it's going to rename the class definition, rename all of the constructors, and also rename the file. So that's something that I don't think most people do that by hand anymore. But Android Studio can do so many other things. You can like extract methods, extract classes, you can move code from one class to the other class, you can extract interfaces, inline interfaces. It has such a wide variety of stuff you can do. You can even like, if you have a set of complex if statements, you can just ask Android Studio to flip them and to change the Boolean expression and do all of those simple things. But you can ask Android Studio to do it, and then it's going to be a lot faster, a lot less error prone, and you're just going to have like more time to focus on the stuff that you like doing most, right? Which is building really cool and exciting features. So you can just automate all of the dull work away. So that's why I'm also very big on tooling. I actually wrote a couple of blog posts about this, where you can actually see it in action with like live GIFs, like, hey, if you want to clean this up, look at what Android Studio can do for you. And I highly encourage everyone to look into that.
Yeah, one of the blessings of using something like Android Studio, like with IntelliJ, and having a language that is statically typed is precisely these things, right? A lot of like the things that you also mentioned are in a like, flipping like if conditions or doing things like that. Folks might think like, why would I ever do that? Like, why would I need to do that? Like, I mean, the code is the code, right? Like, why would flipping if conditions and all work? But in many of these cases, it seems obvious, but like, the idea is like, how can you write the code as simple as possible so it's not prone to, like, if you look at the piece of code, like you shouldn't scratch your head for 20 minutes to understand what it's doing, and then you're like, oh, that's what it's doing. So all of these tools in many ways help aid that understanding, right?
Yeah, indeed. Because Android Studio, for instance, with the if conditions, it's smart enough to detect that like one part of your if condition is always going to be true. And then it just flags that, and you can say like, hey, simplify. And then suddenly, instead of having two nested ifs, you just have the one anymore.
I think that like makes a lot of sense in terms of like tooling. If you had to like wind like this down, right? What are like some of the things that you would have like, because the other trouble that I find like sometimes is like, well, if folks start this like rewrite, right? How do they follow through with it? Like, what are like some of the things that like, they have to do, because like they're like, as you mentioned, there are a whole bunch of these challenges that they can encounter, right? Do you bail in between? Like, is there like some signal saying, well, this is not worth it, maybe we should like bail and like go back? Or what would you like advise along those lines?
Yeah, so I think, and that's also one of the key reasons why I'm not a big fan of rewrites, is the key thing to do always is just like release, because only when you ship something to users and users can actually try it out, then you will know that your code works, then your code actually does what it's supposed to do. So it's about risk mitigation. So just try to reduce the risk as much as you can, minimize your time to market, make sure you maximize user value. So maybe that means like if you're running out of time rewriting your app, maybe you should just like try to separate off all of the settings of like the old app and include them in the new app. And then, maybe you'll rewrite them in the future. Maybe you won't, but at least you'll have the opportunity to do so. And then also make sure that like, above all, with refactoring, you can make things incrementally better. So that's always your go-to friend, to just take the small steps. But if you need to have the real bigger steps, make sure to modularize everything. And then you can really do these very bigger, riskier changes, and automate your testing as much as you can, and release. I can't say that more than enough.
Yeah, automated testing is definitely something that has proven beneficial. The release more often aspect is also like something that it's one of those weird, it's one of those ideals that we always know we're supposed to do, but it's like so hard to do, right? Because you start and you're like, oh, but like, let me just sneak this in. Let me just like add just a little more. Like, I mean, like, surely I can add this as well. And then the next thing you know, you have like this big blob of changes that can potentially be a make or break situation. So also very good advice.
And then you get a bit scared of releasing that because it's so big, and then you won't release at that point, and then you postpone the release a bit further. And not releasing just makes you scared of releasing, and you end up postponing releases even further.
Jeroen, this has been like super helpful. Thank you so much. Like, I think there's a lot of like crucial like gems that are like in this. But are there any specific resources that you would like to point listeners to that you think helped you in the process of like coming up with this talk, or like in your when you decided to like rewrite the app? What are some of the things that like helped guide you? Like, are there some resources you can point our listeners to as well if they wanted to like learn more about the topic?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a few good blog posts by Chet Fowler and also by Joel Spolsky about the big rewrite or things you should never do. I'll make sure that they end up in the show notes. And then obviously, if you want to look at a very recent example, then I highly recommend the Uber blog post, because it's really, especially also, it may not be easy for us to do that like they did, but at least it's a very, very interesting use case to study and learn from, right?
Right. And I know you've written a couple of blog posts too, so we'll make sure to like add links to some of the ones that you've written as well.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks.
All right. Jeroen, this has been a lot of fun. If folks have more questions they want to like ask you directly, or like, learn from your experiences in this, what's a good place to reach you at?
Yeah, the easiest would be on Twitter. So that's @molsjeroen, MOLSJEROEN.
Alrighty. And for those who have trouble spelling that name, as me and Don did initially, we'll make sure to add that in the show notes. Don, if folks have trouble pronouncing your name or finding your name, what's a good place to do that?
You can find me on Twitter or Instagram @DonFelker. And Kaushik, if folks want to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Kaushik Gopal on Twitter. That's a good place to do that. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Jeroen, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun. It's an important topic. It's a topic that inevitably, almost all developers run into. And I think a lot of the stuff you said today is very helpful. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Alrighty. Thank you all for listening. We will catch you in the next episode. I want to thank Sentry for sponsoring today's show. Their tagline is, "Your code is broken, let's fix it together." They're a super cool crash reporting service that gives you all the helpful details that you need when detecting and fixing errors in your application. Don't wait for your users to report your errors and crashes. Use Sentry to catch them earlier. Check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Once again, because Sentry is a common word, I want to make sure you get it right. Sentry.io. My thanks to Sentry for sponsoring today's show. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.